Hello and welcome along to another episode of Edie's Susty Talk. That is our video interview series designed to keep you feeling connected to the sustainability conversation during lockdown again, and beyond. And at this point in the calendar year, we are taking the opportunity to speak to some of the experts who are going to be appearing at our Sustainability Leaders Forum event in February, which is going to be virtual for the first time ever. And today I'm delighted to have Wayne Hubbard from the London Waste and Recycling Board on the call. How are you, Wayne?
Yeah, I'm very well, thanks. I'm doing all right. It's, I mean, we're going to be doing the conference in February, that's right, isn't it? But you're talking to me just coming up to Christmas. So I'm very much looking forward to a bit of a break and then to get back to work with re-energized for the new year.
Yeah, I think we're all at that point now. We can see a little bit of a silver lining.
Yeah, indeed.
For sure. And obviously, Wayne, I've met you a fair few times. We've called a fair few times. But for people at home who might not be aware of your work and the board, could you tell us a little bit about what it does and what your role and remit is there?
Yeah, so I work for the London Waste and Recycling Board. We're a partnership of the Mayor of London and London's boroughs, and we're a statutory board. We have some funds and some programs essentially aimed at reducing waste and increasing recycling, and ultimately we want to reduce London's contribution to climate change by reducing consumption-based emissions. So we have programs delivered to support London boroughs in terms of operational waste management, but we also have lots of support for businesses to help them develop more circular economy business models.
Great. And what have you been focusing on in 2020? And is that what you expected to focus on maybe this time last year, or have you had to redo things? So when I've been thinking about waste in London before, I've done so many stories about reusable coffee cups and about water refill stations and about what we do at train stations, and obviously it's just completely different this year.
Yeah, that's right. We spent a lot of time last year revising our business plan for the next 5 years. I think, like a lot of organisations, they saw 2020 to 2025 as an opportunity to take a pause and to rethink what they were doing. Little did we know, that the whole world was going to take a break. But we decided in 2019 to focus our efforts on reducing consumption-based emissions. So all of our programs were framed around that. The big difference, of course, at the start of 2020 was one, operational. So how could we support London local authorities to continue to offer residents waste collection services primarily, and then waste recycling services? So how could we keep that going? How could we support them? And we did a lot of work on social media, a lot of work on communications. We work with London local authorities really closely to enable that to happen. For example, we noticed that commercial waste obviously massively reduced, but there was a big increase in waste at home in that period of time. Mm-hmm. And there were crews off, so we kind of helped to get the commercial sector to help the public sector where there was capacity to do that, and to keep things working. So that was one of the things that we did. We also helped businesses to pivot. So some businesses who were, for example, dealing with food that wasn't sold the previous day in artisanal bakeries started mm-hmm. delivering food to people who were quarantining at home, those kinds of things. So our focus in the first bit of lockdown was around just helping things to carry on and keeping the wheels turning. And then latterly, we've been working with London local authorities and the Mayor of London around a green recovery. So now our work is focused on green recovery, but all of those things still have and retain that element of reducing consumption-based emissions, promoting a circular economy, and ensuring reduced waste and increased recycling. So that core bit of our mission hasn't changed at all. And in fact, helping the transition to a circular economy, I think, is even more important now as we seek to build back greener, build back better, and build more resilient supply chains, and then think about how our high street and our neighbourhoods are going to look like post-COVID. I imagine there'll be some significant differences.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And it's interesting, this focus on consumption-based emissions, because often we see sort of low carbon over here and then waste and resources over here. But obviously that has been debunked by a number of organisations, including the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And I think the last time we spoke was actually, I was covering a story about the board partnering with Glasgow's Chamber of Commerce, and that was ahead of COP26. And on that specific topic, so obviously COP has since been delayed, but how are you guys preparing for that at the moment?
Well, we're working with our partners, the GLA and others, to I mean, our focus is to try and use that event to promote the idea that there are 45% of global emissions tied up with the things that we consume. Mm-hmm. And yet the talk and discussion around reducing consumption-based emissions seems to be relatively limited. The work that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation did was real revelation, I think, in trying to demonstrate that this 45% of emissions are really quite tricky to mitigate and abate. You can't, and it's not easy to kind of to change energy systems and to retrofit buildings. That isn't easy, but it's quite difficult to ask people to reduce consumption by I don't know, buying less clothes from new rather than renting them, mm-hmm. or buying second hand or buying recycled clothing. It's another kind of it's another step, isn't it, to try and get people to take less journeys and reduce the amount of personal transport they have, and to change their food habits. That's a whole different thing from these big infrastructural changes that you tend to get talked about at things like the COP. So we need to think about behaviour change, and I think we need to think about that 45% of emissions that you can't change the energy system and expect, I don't know, the production of aluminium or steel or whatever, or agriculture. That doesn't affect those things. And I think that's the revelatory element that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation work by material economics, has kind of introduced, and also the work that the C40 have done on consumption-based emissions and the role that cities can play. And we really want to, I think, promote that kind of thinking at COP and get governments to start thinking about how they're going to take responsibility for the emissions that are essentially offshored, because it's citizens in London consuming stuff that's produced predominantly in the southern hemisphere, and those emissions are associated with those countries in a typical COP sense. So we want to start thinking about that. The recent Committee on Climate Change sixth carbon budget actually mentions the circular economy 4 times, which is 4 more times than the previous budget. So I guess there has been some progress.
Mm-hmm. No, I've definitely heard more about the circular economy at Davos than at COP in my time that I've been covering this.
Yeah.
And obviously that might even be delayed itself.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's been we signed a letter in June with, or rather, the Deputy Mayor of London, Shirley Rodriguez, signed a letter with other CEOs and world leaders to, promoting the idea that the circular economy could help us build back better. So it's definitely something that businesses are aware of. I just think that national governments tend to be, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but they tend to move, because it's the nature of the beast, they tend to move at a slower pace than cities can move. So cities can be relatively agile in the way they respond to these things. In London, 29 London boroughs have declared a climate emergency, and their residents and the politicians are all really interested in how they can play a part in reducing their contribution to climate change, whether that be through retrofit, introducing sustainable transport systems, or reducing consumption-based emissions. I know there's a lot of focus on that, and there's a lot of interest in that, and that's happening in a way almost as a separate thing to what's happening at the international level. So I find that really interesting, that local neighbourhoods and high streets, and even on the street level, all of this activity is starting to happen, and some of it's been promoted by COVID in a weird kind of way. The amount of WhatsApp groups or neighbourhood apps that have sprung up, and people sharing things locally, or sharing excess food waste, or there's been loads of people in my street who have putting stuff out rather than taking it to the charity shop and saying that, or asking people if they've got a drill they can borrow rather than going out and buying one. And that's, I find, just a really interesting and hopefully long-lasting habit that people are starting to get into.
For sure. We've talked there about the super local level and about the international level. So I was hoping to touch on the national piece as well. My colleague said the other day that there's been a sort of advent calendar of policy announcements with things like the energy white paper and the 10-point plan. But I seem to have had less about waste and resource management. I've also been made aware that some of the consultations for the resources and waste strategies has been delayed again. So what have you been seeing on a national level, and what would you like to see on a national level ahead of COP?
Well, I mean, it is a good thing that the government have mentioned their 10-point plan. I think that's great. There's nothing on consumption, and as you say, there's nothing on waste. So that's what's missing. It's the missing piece of the jigsaw. It's the bit. I think that national governments tend to get they tend to get involved in big infrastructure things, and the 10-point plan is a good example of that. And when we speak to officials at DEFRA, I think traditionally, not necessarily so much now, they've kind of got stuck on waste reduction, and I think it's been really something that's been not given the priority that it deserves to have had. The circular economy, to my mind, is all about waste reduction. So when we talk about a circular economy, we're talking about how do we not produce waste? Because if we're managing waste, we've already created the problem, haven't we? We've already had the consumption, and now we're thinking about how we can recycle it or dispose of it. What we want to do is not get it to the point where it's waste. So when we think about a circular economy, we think about a future where we have a world without waste. And I know that kind of, people will say, well, zero waste, it doesn't exist, there's no such thing. But really, we can get very close to it, I think, with a circular economy. And just to give you an idea of the scale of change that we need in order to hit that 1.5 degree Paris target, London's per capita consumption-based emissions are currently something like 12.6 tons. So each person has 12.6 tons of consumption-based greenhouse gas CO2 equivalent emissions. Each person creates that. By 2050, that number has to be 0.6.
Wow.
So that's the kind of, by 2030, we've got to reduce that by around 2/3. So it's got to be a quick change, and it's got to be a very deep and long-lasting change, and that's going to lead to a world, I think, where we have very different habits, and the business models that are required in order for us to achieve that are going to have to be very different. So we need to start talking about that quite quickly. And whilst it's great that the government are talking about infrastructure and about building stuff, we all have to start thinking about supporting businesses that share, repair, where we're leasing, that have recycled content in them. That's the kind of businesses that we're going to have to start interacting with, and which increasingly I think we will start interacting with over the next 5 to 10 years.
For sure. Well, fingers crossed that we have more good news in this space in 2021, especially given that that strategy is meant to be implemented in full by 2025. It does feel like it's just creeping up.
It does, but I mean, the Mayor of London has just announced some Green New Deal funding. So there is a Green New Deal in London, and the London Waste and Recycling Board have been the recipient of a significant quantum of funding to release to support circular economy SMEs within our Advanced London programme. So there is a will out there, certainly in London, and that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. Cities can make quick decisions; they can deliver support quickly to local businesses at a London-wide level and at a very sort of micro level, and that's the kind of thing that we need, I think. And that I'm very optimistic for the future if we use this opportunity to build back greener and really develop that low carbon circular economy that we need in order to survive.
I know it's not just London either. I think I got a piece of research the other day stating that something like 2/3 of local authorities in the UK have declared a climate emergency.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely not just in London.
But I think there's a real opportunity here for us to respond to citizens who they want to do something. I think they want to feel that their actions can reduce carbon emissions, and they want to contribute to abating that climate emergency. And one of the ways that we can do that really easily is by giving them access to circular businesses. They probably don't know that some of the things they do, like, I don't know, reading a book on Kindle, I'm sure someone's going to say, oh no, but that's got a carbon cost to it. I'm sure it has. But dematerialization through streaming music or streaming video, or that thing I mentioned about sharing your drill, all of these things, actually you could probably calculate the carbon saving that you've made by doing that. So if we can give residents and citizens the tools that they need by promoting circular economy businesses to enable them to take part in the circular economy, all of that is helping in a small way to save the world. It really is. You're making that contribution, and I think that's quite empowering. And that goes from the person who's collecting your waste or recycling your waste, all the way through to somebody who's buying a vintage secondhand Genie Traxxas, or whatever it is they're buying. That was me recently, by the way. It's a real example.
There's just lots of pieces to it, isn't there? So there's awareness, like you mentioned, then there's education, like do we know how to repair and share our things? And then we've talked about the business and the policy pieces too. So hopefully lots of exciting moving parts to look at in 2021. But Wayne, we're running out of time, and I have one very pressing question to finish on, which is, it's that time of year where we're asking everyone about their sustainability related New Year's resolutions for work. So did you get some time to think about this one?
Has this got to be professional, or is it personal? I mean, I think both. Well, professionally, we do a podcast at the London Waste and Recycling Board. I do it with my colleague Ali Moore, who's the head of comms, and my New Year's resolution, I think, is to do at least one a month, if not one a week, and have lots of interviews of just some fascinating people that we come into contact with as part of our business support program and our wider work in the circular economy. So with local authority officers, but also just entrepreneurs and interesting policy people. So we want to do more of those. We've not been so good at getting those out, but that's my New Year's resolution. My personal New Year's resolution is I'm going to try and avoid buying new clothes. That's going to be interesting. So I'm going to significantly reduce my consumption of clothing, which I think is probably the next thing on my list. I'm already vegan, so I now need to do. I don't want to kind of present this as hair shirtism. You don't have to kind of be a vegan to save the world. You just have to eat a bit less meat, and you have to buy less clothes. So that's on my tick list.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for your time, Wayne, and looking forward to hearing what else you have to say in your presentation at the Sustainability Leaders Forum.
Looking forward to it.